Rain spattered across the barbed wire and the muddy tarmac of a provisional Allied holding area in western Germany in early 1945. A ragged column of German women Flakhelferinnen conscripted into anti-aircraft service stood trembling under guard, wool tunics soaked, breath visible in the cold. They had expected interrogation, seizure of personal effects, deprivation. Instead, an American sergeant led them toward a wooden shed and announced they would be washed, issued soap and clean undergarments, and given access to a hot towel. Faces that had hardened to survive the front collapsed into incredulous silence. Some pressed gloved hands to mouths as if astonishment itself might be forbidden. German accounts later recorded that disbelief. Capture, they had learned, could look like care. To understand how that scene became policy, we go back to the winter of 1944. As Allied formations pushed east after Normandy and through the autumn offensives, the number of prisoners arriving at processing points climbed sharply. U.S. Army Medical Corps officers, provost marshals, and quartermaster detachments confronted a straightforward imperative. Contagious disease and lice in overcrowded compounds threatened both prisoners and guards and could undermine operational effectiveness. What began as ad hoc triage, separating the visibly ill, issuing basic sanitary supplies, and improvising washing stations at staging depots, was systematically documented, tested and gradually formalized into a set of hygiene protocols designed for mass processing. Those pilots were scaled and standardized in early 1945 after the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen on 7th of March, 1945, and the larger Rhine crossings later that month. Thousands of captured auxiliaries and frontline personnel passed through American camps established near Remagen, Heilbronn, and Landshut. Quartermaster convoys transported water heaters, soap rations, and replacement clothing. Medical Corps detachments erected delousing stations and conducted medical screenings. Where available, chemical powders such as DDT were used for delousing. Where supplies were thin, hot water, soap, deliberate laundering, and simple sanitation routines proved effective at cutting infestations and enteric illness. The consequences were both practical and symbolic. U.S. medical officers recorded notable drops in dysentery and other enteric diseases in camps that adopted the full regimen, with some reports suggesting incidence rates fell by roughly half. Guards and medical staff were less frequently sidelined by outbreaks, and processing throughput improved. Psychologically, the gesture of basic cleanliness undermined expectations. German prisoners who had braced for humiliation instead encountered a protocol that restored small measures of dignity, and German intelligence correspondents recorded concern that such care could function as soft power to erode civilian and military morale. The rain-slick yard was therefore not merely a sanitation point, but a probing of loyalties and perceptions. Next, we will examine the Medical Corps reports, quartermaster improvisations, and field orders that turned hygiene from expedient public health into an instrument of influence on the collapsing Western Front. By the summer of 1944, as the beaches of Normandy filled with the wreckage of invasion and the thunder of artillery rolled inland through hedgerows and orchards, another logistical challenge quietly shadowed the Allied advance. What to do with the rapidly swelling ranks of captured Germans? Columns of prisoners, dust-covered, disarmed, and disoriented, moved under guard toward temporary cages and collection points hastily fenced in behind the front lines. Among them, for the first time on such a scale, were women, auxiliaries of the Luftwaffe and the flak units, radar operators, typists, nurses, and anti-aircraft gunners who had manned the 88s along the French coast. The Allied command soon realized that the capture of these women posed not only administrative, but moral and medical questions, none of which had clear precedents. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required that prisoners be afforded all measures necessary for health and hygiene, but this principle had often proved hollow in practice. The Allied Medical Corps knew that overcrowding and poor sanitation had turned many Italian and North African holding areas into breeding grounds for disease. Surgeon General James C. Magee, whose office oversaw the health of all U.S. forces in the European theater, warned that unchecked epidemics could sweep through camps and across the front lines as easily as rumors. Typhus, dysentery, and lice were invisible enemies that recognized no uniform. The experiences of 1943 in Italy particularly the improved sanitation layouts, tested at the Capua depot near Naples, had demonstrated that a methodical hygiene system could prevent outbreaks and maintain discipline. But those measures had been designed for men. The presence of female POWs demanded something new. In early 1944, planners in the European Theatre of Operations, ETO, began drafting a universal hygiene policy for all enemy captives. Field reports noted that German women had become integral to the Reich's air defense network, Flakwaffenhelferinnen, Luftschutzwardens, and communications auxiliaries who served under the Luftwaffe command structure. Many were barely out of school, hastily trained and sent to operate searchlights and rangefinders under relentless Allied bombing. Their capture carried both symbolic and psychological weight. These were not combatants in the traditional sense, but they were unmistakably part of Hitler's war machine. To handle them humanely and in accordance with international law, the Americans required female medical personnel, gender-segregated quarters, and facilities that would preserve modesty and dignity without compromising sanitary standards. The policy's architects argued that treating these women with decency would yield dividends beyond medical safety. It could fracture enemy morale and demonstrate moral superiority. As one internal ETO memorandum phrased it, cleanliness itself is a form of persuasion. Thus, by mid-1944, as the front pushed eastward from Normandy through the fields of France, the U.S. Army prepared to put its new hygiene doctrine to the test, not as a humanitarian afterthought, but as a calculated experiment in both public health and psychological warfare. The stage was now set for the first operational trials of this system in the field. By the opening months of 1944, hygiene had become a calculated instrument of policy, an engineering project as much as a medical one. The U.S. Army's 15th Corps Medical Division, confronting the dual threats of epidemic disease and prisoner unrest, formalized what had once been field improvisation into a comprehensive doctrine. The result was a compact manual titled The Prisoner of War Hygiene Handbook, issued in January that year. It read less like a medical pamphlet and more like a set of blueprints for an industrial operation. Every component was standardized. The shower stalls measured precisely 2 meters square, delivering 75 pounds per square inch of water pressure in 15-minute hot water cycles. The laundry boilers featured rotating drums capable of scrubbing and rinsing 500 garments per hour. Wastewater drainage, temperature regulation, and steam venting systems were laid out in schematic form so that any engineer or medical officer could assemble the system within days. The delousing chambers were equally sophisticated. Designed to exterminate lice and flea populations that carried typhus, they employed 10% DDT aerosols and steam tunnels, calibrated to 60 degrees Celsius for 30-minute exposures, enough to sterilize both clothing and bedding. Entire buildings could be repurposed for the process, but the innovation lay in their modularity. Units could be disassembled, loaded onto trucks, and reassembled as the front advanced. Allied engineers insisted that sanitation could not lag behind victory. Clean water and controlled environments were to move forward with the troops. To meet that demand, the 1146th Engineer Combat Battalion and other units designed prefabricated shower complexes, collapsible and transportable. Constructed from aluminum frames and canvas siding, each unit included its own boiler system, drainage trench, and water purification tank. A single unit cost about $3,200 in 1944 dollars, and a full POW camp might require a dozen to sustain rotations of several thousand prisoners. Behind the technical efficiency, however, stood a subtler logic. Military psychologists and public affairs officers understood that cleanliness had symbolic power. It could recondition behavior, reshape perceptions, and even destabilize enemy morale. Thus, by October 1944, new POW handling orders, issued under the U.S. European Theatre Command, explicitly described hygiene as incentive. Clean prisoner was not only a healthier one, but also a more cooperative and impressionable subject. For the Allies, soap and steam became quiet tools of persuasion, proof that decency could be used as strategy. Every bolt turned and boiler tested therefore served two missions: to prevent disease and to project civilization itself as a weapon. By the end of that year, the machinery stood ready. created in depots behind the front lines, waiting for its first real test amid the ruins of a collapsing Reich in the deep winter of 1944. As snow muffled the forests of the Ardennes and the front lines dissolved into confusion, the American capture of German female auxiliaries began almost by accident. The Battle of the Bulge had drawn in every reserve unit the Reich could muster, including Luftwaffe clerks, signal operators, and anti-aircraft assistants hastily repurposed for ground defense. Among those retreating westward from the Siegfried Line were detachments of Flakwaffenhelferinnen, young women trained to operate, rangefinders and radar instruments, who now found themselves trudging through the sleet toward Allied positions near Liège and Aachen. When American patrols intercepted them, the captives were bewildered, half-frozen, and unsure whether they would be treated as soldiers or as civilians. By January 1945, a small contingent of these women reached a provisional holding area outside Maastricht, under the supervision of Colonel Kenneth Bradley of the 101st Medical Group. The site, little more than a fenced compound beside a rail siding, became the stage for an experiment that would later reverberate through German intelligence reports. Bradley's officers, following new directives from the 15th Corps Medical Division, assembled a compact shower and delousing installation, 4 prefabricated stalls, a boiler drum, and a DDT spray chamber, capable of processing roughly 120 women in rotation. The prisoners were marched to it in pairs, their boots sinking into the thawing mud, eyes darting at the sight of buckets, scrub brushes, and hissing water pipes. Many hesitated, suspecting humiliation or trickery, but the American medics, speaking through interpreters, reassured them. This was for cleanliness, not punishment. What followed was small in scale but profound in effect. The camp's medical logs for the week of 12-18 January 1945 recorded that lice infestations among the women dropped from 60% to 12% after 2 rounds of washing and delousing. Blankets were boiled, hair was trimmed, and each prisoner received soap and a clean undershirt. The women left the facility subdued but visibly transformed. Some wept quietly, others murmured disbelief. Within days, word began to circulate through other holding areas near Eupen and Monschau. The Americans let us bathe. For soldiers conditioned by propaganda to expect brutality, such reports carried an unsettling dissonance. 2 months later, in March 1945, as the U.S. Ninth Army crossed the Rhine and established bridgeheads at Remagen, the hygiene experiment was expanded. Engineer battalions installed permanent modular units capable of processing hundreds of prisoners daily. Among the first to use them were female POWs captured from the collapsing Ruhr pocket, who found themselves ushered into gleaming tin stalls under electric lamps. To those who had endured weeks of retreat and bombardment, the sight of hot running water and clean towels felt unreal, an inversion of everything they had been told about the enemy. Rumors spread faster than official reports. Captured women who had bathed under Allied supervision returned to mixed camps where their stories rippled through the ranks. The Americans were not tormentors, but paradoxically, providers. Inside Germany, intercepted conversations and letters hinted at confusion, even envy, among soldiers still in the field. By the time Allied interrogators began reading Wehrmacht and SS intelligence memos, they discovered the astonishment had been noted at the highest levels. German officers asked one another in disbelief, why would the enemy show mercy? The answer, as they would soon realize, was that mercy itself had become a weapon. The next stage of the story unfolds within those secret reports, where hygiene, of all things, became a subject of counterintelligence concern. By March 1945, the shock of Allied hygiene practices had begun to echo deep within the German command structure. Reports reaching Wehrmacht intelligence and the Sicherheitsdienst, SD, revealed a subtle but dangerous phenomenon. Stories of humane treatment were spreading faster than fear. In the aftermath of the Rhine crossings, German female auxiliaries who had been captured, processed, and then repatriated, or transferred to camps within Germany, became inadvertent messengers. Their testimonies contradicted years of official propaganda that had painted the Americans as barbaric and vengeful. What they described instead were warm showers, soap rations, delousing, and replacement clothing, tokens of civility amid the ruin. An SD field office in Cologne filing its March report to Berlin summarized the problem with uneasy candor. Some captured German women report that American guards provided warm showers, soap, and even new clothing. This sows doubt whether our propaganda about enemy brutality holds firm. The phrasing betrayed both alarm and disbelief. To the regime's intelligence officers, such rumors were as corrosive as artillery fire. They eroded ideological certainty. In Düsseldorf, a memorandum issued from Army Group B's headquarters in early April 1945 warned that these misleading impressions could weaken discipline among Flakwaffenhelferinnen, still manning guns around the Ruhr. Commanders were instructed to reassert vigilance and reinforce faith in the Reich's moral narrative, but the damage had already begun. Interrogations followed. Captured women returning from Allied camps were questioned, sometimes brutally, by Gestapo field offices. According to later testimonies, interrogators pressed them with pointed accusations. Had the Americans used these soft tactics deliberately? Had they spoken kindly, offered gifts, sought to win allegiance? The tone of the questioning revealed the regime's insecurity. To the Nazi hierarchy, the mere suggestion that compassion could be wielded as strategy was intolerable. Evidence of this anxiety surfaced again in the Wehrmacht's Z Field Report, number 98, dated 12 April 1945, which concluded tersely that the Allies now wage psychological warfare by kindness. The line was underlined twice in red, pencil on surviving copies, a visual mark of recognition that the front was not only collapsing militarily but morally. Hygiene, the most mundane of human needs, had become a battlefield of perception. Some Axis officers proposed countermeasures. Orders circulated in scattered commands, forbidding female returnees from discussing their treatment in captivity, while others suggested reviving hardship propaganda to reassert the idea of a ruthless enemy. Yet such efforts were futile. Rumors carried by truck drivers, medics, and railway clerks continued to spread through a population increasingly aware of the war's hopelessness. The Allies had achieved a symbolic victory with minimal cost. Soap and steam had done what leaflets and radio broadcasts rarely could. By late April, as the Reich's front lines disintegrated and Allied forces prepared for the occupation of Germany, the U.S. Medical and Engineer Corps faced a different problem altogether: how to scale their hygiene operations for the flood of new prisoners expected in the final weeks of the war. The next stage would demand not improvisation, but industrial precision, a logistical system capable of cleansing a defeated army by the tens of thousands. That expansion brought the Allies into a new phase of organization, one that fused military engineering with the machinery of public health. The sheer scale of the operation resembled an industrial enterprise rather than a field experiment. Even before the war's end, American quartermaster contracts, signed as early as May 1944, had transformed sanitation from a local necessity into a standardized production line. Companies like the G.A. Zimmerman Corporation and Warner Engineering Works were tasked with manufacturing prefabricated plumbing systems and steam boilers, each designed to meet the technical specifications outlined in the 15th Corps Medical Division's Hygiene Manual. The result was a system of remarkable uniformity: shower stalls of 2-meter cubicles, boiler drums with calibrated pressure gauges, and delousing chambers whose doors sealed like those of naval compartments. By the middle of 1945, this network had delivered over 200 modular shower units, 150 portable laundries, and 300 delousing installations to the European theatre. Each came crated, numbered, and accompanied by a field assembly manual. The units moved through the main continental ports, Antwerp, Cherbourg, and Le Havre, before dispersing inland along rail lines toward Dijon, Liège, and Bremen. Behind the front, engineer battalions such as the 1602nd and 1202nd laid down 10-centimeter water mains, drawing from nearby rivers and reservoirs to maintain consistent pressure and flow. Water pumps operated around the clock, their rhythmic drone joining the ambient soundtrack of depots and supply yards across liberated Europe. The logistical requirements were immense. Each full POW bath complex demanded 200 liters of fuel oil per day. and coal consumption could reach 10 tons daily to sustain the boilers. These figures, entered into quartermaster ledgers, illustrate the depth of commitment the Allies invested in a policy that at first glance might seem peripheral to combat. Fuel convoys had to be prioritized. Purification tablets, piping, and spare valves shared cargo space with ammunition and rations. Yet senior logistics officers defended the allocation on both strategic and moral grounds. Preventing epidemics was as critical as preventing ammunition shortages, and demonstrating humane efficiency was a blow to Axis morale. Parallel systems developed for consumables. Supply depots in Normandy and northern France coordinated the shipment of sodium talawatt soap bars, towels, toothbrushes, and sanitary kits, reaching a peak monthly volume of 500,000 bars of soap by late 1944. The precision of these supply chains reflected lessons learned from industrial America. Assembly line thinking applied to hygiene. Modular design ensured that the same equipment could service men and women alike, with partitions and privacy screens added as required. As these installations spread, the Allies' capacity to process tens of thousands of prisoners expanded exponentially. What had begun as a humanitarian and medical safeguard evolved into a vast infrastructure of rehabilitation and re-education. Every boiler, water pump, and delousing nozzle represented not only mechanical ingenuity, but also an assertion of values, the idea that order and cleanliness could triumph over the chaos of a collapsing regime. The system was now poised to extend into the German heartland itself, where the final waves of surrender would bring millions more prisoners into Allied custody. By the spring of 1945, the Allied hygiene experiment had grown into a continent-spanning operation, reaching deep into the collapsing front lines of the Reich. What had begun months earlier as a small, tentative pilot outside Maastricht now extended across the Western Front, following the steady rhythm of Allied victory. In April, as General Patch's 7th Army advanced through Lorraine, captured Luftwaffe auxiliaries, women who had manned telephones and searchlights in Metz and Nancy, were marched to newly established shower and delousing facilities built beside the Army's logistics depots. The equipment gleamed with the precision of American engineering, steam pipes snaking into wooden huts, galvanized tanks rumbling as boilers came to life. To the women who entered, the scene was disorienting. Clean water where they expected interrogation, warmth where they had braced for degradation. Further north, in the lower Rhine corridor, the hygiene system expanded again. At the Wesel POW camp, organized under the umbrella of Operation Plunder, Flakwaffenhelferinnen captured from anti-aircraft batteries around Duisburg, and Emmerich received full laundry rotations, soap distributions, and delousing treatments supervised by the Medical Corps. American field reports noted their initial disbelief. Some refused to undress until female medical aides demonstrated the showers themselves. By the end of the week, camp logs recorded near-total compliance and a dramatic improvement in health. Medical data from Third Army camps near Koblenz offered empirical proof of success. By May 1945, within 2 weeks of integrating the hygiene regimen, the incidence of fungal foot infections and lice-related dermatitis among female prisoners dropped by 40% compared to male-only facilities. Cleanliness had become measurable strategy. Engineers from the 1602nd Engineer Combat Battalion continued to deploy modular bathhouses during the Ruhr encirclement in late May and June, servicing camps near Essen, Dortmund, and Wuppertal. There, the constant roar of generators and hiss of steam joined the ambient sound of surrender, the mechanical pulse of an empire in its final collapse. Beyond sanitation, the results rippled into morale. News of Allied hygiene treatment spread through fragmented German networks still holding out in the Harz Mountains and along the Elbe, reaching units that had yet to face capture. Letters intercepted by Allied censors described disbelief. They say the Americans let them wash, even gave them towels. For the soldiers still clinging to Hitler's rhetoric of total war, such reports felt like heresy. Cleanliness, something so ordinary, had become an emblem of contradiction. Each new implementation confirmed what the early trials had suggested. Hygiene was both practical and psychological warfare. It preserved health, accelerated camp discipline, and quietly dismantled the moral armor of an enemy raised to expect cruelty. As delousing units rolled forward behind the advancing armies, they carried with them more than soap and steam. They carried a message that the war's end would not be defined solely by force, but by the reassertion of humanity itself. The next stage would reveal just how deeply that message unsettled the German mind. For the German women prisoners, the moment of being handed a bar of soap or a clean towel was more than an act of hygiene. It was an assault on the moral architecture they had been raised to believe. Years of propaganda had insisted that capture meant violation, degradation, and death, that the enemy was barbaric. Yet in American camps, these women found warm water, modesty curtains, disinfected uniforms, and polite guards. The contradictions struck deep. Some reacted with suspicion, waiting for the cruelty that never came. Others broke down in tears under the weight of sudden humanity. Allied psychological officers later noted a recurring pattern. The first wash often triggered emotional release and disorientation. One SD transcript captured a returning auxiliary's words. "We dared not believe we deserved this." What had been intended as simple sanitation had become psychological shock therapy, dismantling ideological conditioning through cleanliness. The ripple effects spread quickly. Male German POWs, hearing rumors of the women's treatment, began to question the moral asymmetry of their own command. "If the Americans treat our women with decency," one prisoner asked during interrogation at Reims, "then why do our officers treat us like expendable beasts?" In subtle but measurable ways, discipline and defiance among POWs softened. U.S. interrogators began to strategically reference the hygiene program, implying that cooperation could earn additional comforts, more showers, cleaner clothes, better rations. Reports from the Psychological Warfare Division in April 1945 recorded higher rates of voluntary intelligence among female prisoners than among male combatants. Meanwhile, across the collapsing Reich, German counterintelligence was alarmed. Sicherheitsdienst (SD) summaries labeled these reports geistige Zersetzung, mental corrosion. To the Nazi state, kindness was not compassion. It was subversion. Each rumor that American guards had been courteous to captured German women undercut years of cultivated fear. Gestapo officers interrogated repatriated auxiliaries, probing whether the Americans used soap and showers as tools of manipulation, a darkly ironic question coming from a regime that weaponized starvation. At field hospitals near Münster, wounded soldiers overheard whispers of those women they bathe. Even among the broken remnants of Wehrmacht units, the rumor carried a sting of shame and doubt. If the enemy behaved more humanely than their own leaders, what had they been fighting for? Thus the hygiene campaign, initially a logistical innovation, evolved into a subtle instrument of psychological warfare. It eroded enemy morale not through propaganda broadcasts or leaflets, but through tangible sensory proof of decency. In the quiet hiss of a steam pipe and the lather of soap, the moral narrative of the Reich began to dissolve. The next section will trace how Allied strategists recognized this unexpected power and how it began shaping post-war occupation, policies, and the reconstruction of German civilian morale in the months that followed. Though hygiene alone could never determine the outcome of a campaign, by spring 1945, it had become an unexpectedly potent psychological lever within the Allied arsenal. What began as a medical safeguard evolved into a symbolic reassurance of decency and order, a message that traveled faster than most propaganda leaflets ever could. In the Rhine and Ruhr operations, where surrender negotiations often hinged on morale, Allied officers learned to invoke hygiene as a promise that prisoners, male or female, would not be brutalized but cleaned, fed, and treated humanely. To German ears conditioned by years of Nazi fear-mongering, this sounded almost implausible. Yet the promise was consistently kept. Reports from U.S. Ninth Army psychological warfare teams note that mentioning showers and clean clothing frequently reduced resistance during capitulations, especially among Flakwaffen and Luftwaffe women's detachments manning anti-aircraft batteries. Eyewitness testimonies from captured auxiliaries tell a quiet, revealing story. As Allied patrols approached, some women reportedly asked, "Will we be allowed to wash?" as if that question itself were the boundary between fear and surrender. Guards who answered yes often found compliance immediate. Such seemingly minor gestures shortened sieges, hastened surrenders, and replaced terror with exhaustion and relief. The optical effect was just as powerful. In towns like Wesel and Duisburg, civilians who saw female prisoners arriving from American custody, combed, clothed, and visibly unharmed, began to question Nazi radio bulletins that still warned of Allied atrocities. The image of captured women treated with respect became a subtle propaganda reversal, undermining the regime's last reserves of credibility. Even the Wehrmacht noticed. Field communiques from late April 1945 contained new warnings to troops. Do not fraternize over stories of the Americans bathing our auxiliaries. Strategically, the hygiene policy functioned as both moral counterpoint and morale weapon. It contrasted Allied discipline against the chaos and cruelty of a dying Reich, reinforcing the perception of American ethical superiority. It also served a long-term purpose, laying the groundwork for the moral authority of the post-war occupation, where cleanliness became synonymous with civilization, rehabilitation and order. Yet the program had limitations. It could not erase the deeper trauma of captivity, nor prevent instances of abuse elsewhere. Hygiene could soothe bodies and signal mercy, but it could not mend the ideological wreckage left by total war. Still, within its narrow scope, it achieved something rare, a small, tangible victory of humanity amid ruin. This brings us to the final phase of the story, how the hygiene initiative was adapted after Germany's surrender, influencing early denazification efforts, refugee care, and the reconstruction of Germany's public health system under Allied supervision. The hygiene initiative, though visionary in its aims, never operated without friction. Its expansion across the collapsing front of 1944-45 exposed the limits of engineering in war, where mud, frost, and ideology often conspired against even the most disciplined logistics. In forward zones, water scarcity remained the chief obstacle. During the Battle of the Bulge, temperatures plunged well below freezing. Pipes froze solid, boilers cracked, and showerheads produced only trickles of ice. Some units resorted to melting snow in oil drums just to maintain minimal washing. Hot water lines often ran uninsulated through improvised barracks, cooling before reaching the stalls. In the bitter cold of January 1945, reports from a POW camp near Eupen noted that the plumbing was more symbolic than functional. Supply shortages compounded the problem. Soap, a seemingly trivial commodity, became a strategic resource. By late January, one detachment recorded reusing bars for up to 2 weeks per rotation. Laundry drums jammed under overuse, and improvised delousing chambers sometimes malfunctioned, filling tents with choking DDT fumes. Every failure had to be patched on the fly. Engineers from the 1202nd Battalion famously salvaged valves from broken laundry units to repair a shower pump at Hamm, keeping one of the few functioning installations in Western Germany alive. The challenges weren't purely mechanical. Cultural resistance emerged in unexpected ways. Among captured German women, some, shaped by years of Nazi moral doctrine, objected to bathing under the supervision of male guards or exposing themselves even to medical personnel. American officers quickly learned that cleanliness could only succeed when paired with dignity. The solution came in the form of female nurses and Red Cross auxiliaries who oversaw bathing areas and created makeshift privacy partitions out of tarpaulins and blankets. What began as a logistical fix soon became policy. On the German intelligence side, skepticism deepened. SD and Wehrmacht analysts speculated that Allied kindness might backfire, that offering showers and soap to the defeated could appear mocking or manipulative. Some memos warned that such gestures could provoke resentment rather than gratitude. Allied planners took note, adjusting their messaging. Hygiene was presented not as charity, but as medical necessity, offered with restraint and professionalism. Each obstacle in turn refined the program. By April 1945, optional participation replaced mandatory delousing cycles. Female POWs could decline without penalty, and camp bulletins explicitly framed the process as a right, not an order. These refinements transformed a mechanical system into a moral statement. Despite its fragility in the field, The hygiene effort had already succeeded where it mattered most, in perception. It demonstrated that even amid destruction, order and decency could still be imposed through design and discipline. The infrastructure may have faltered, but the idea of hygiene as a humane instrument endured, carrying forward into the Allied occupation, post-war refugee camps, and the reconstruction of Germany's public health ethos. Next, we turn to that post-war legacy, how the lessons of POW hygiene influenced the moral and institutional rebuilding of a defeated nation. In the quiet months that followed Germany's surrender, in May 1945, the guns fell silent, but the lessons of moral warfare did not. The Allied high commands, now turned to occupation and reconstruction, began sifting through the record of their own conduct. Among the more unexpected entries preserved in official files was a short report from the U.S. 15th Corps Medical Division, noting the success of its hygienic reconditioning program for prisoners of war. From this modest experiment grew a set of principles that would ripple through future conflicts. By 1946, the idea of humanitarian hygiene for detainees had entered formal doctrine. New U.S. Army field manuals described sanitation and medical care not only as disease prevention, but as instruments of stabilization and re-education. When American planners later faced POW management in Korea and Vietnam, they cited the European theater's late-war hygiene program as a precedent, a moment when order, decency and psychology merged into one policy. What had begun as an engineering exercise in delousing had become a template for humane control. In occupied Germany, too, the echo endured. The emerging Bundeswehr of the 1950s, shaped under Allied supervision, adopted detention standards that implicitly referenced the same Allied guidelines. German officers trained under NATO auspices were taught that the treatment of captives, cleanliness, health, and dignity was not optional, but central to post-war identity. Quietly, the legacy of those female POW showers became a moral touchstone, proof that power could cleanse rather than humiliate. Historians and ethicists still debate its deeper meaning. Was it a true moral gesture, or a calculated act of psychological warfare? Some scholars see in it the earliest form of what later theorists called humane psychological operations, strategies that win submission not through fear, but through civility. Others argue that its power lay less in intent than in contrast, the shock of compassion amid total war. In memoirs published decades later, several former Luftwaffe auxiliaries recalled that moment of disbelief. The warmth of the water, the rough towel, the scent of soap that lingered after captivity, as the instant they realized that the enemy was not the monster they had been taught to imagine. Whether measured in morale, propaganda, or memory, the act endures as a moral paradox. Kindness wielded as strategy, hygiene as a language of victory. In that contradiction lies the episode's lasting resonance. When we return now to that opening scene, the rain, the barbed wire, the hesitant women staring at the steam rising from the showers, we understand it differently. It was not merely a gesture of cleanliness, but a quiet revolution in what warfare could mean, that humanity itself, in the smallest of forms, could become a weapon stronger than fear. Rain slanted across a landscape of wire and mud, hissing softly against the corrugated roofs of a temporary American prisoner compound on the edge of a ruined German town in early 1945. Beneath that grey sky, a line of weary German women prisoners, Luftwaffe auxiliaries, flak gunners, signal clerks, waited in silence, their boots sinking into the wet earth. They had braced for interrogation, for humiliation, for hunger. Instead, they were led toward a low wooden shed from which steam drifted like breath into the cold morning. Inside, hot water roared against tin walls, and the sharp scent of soap cut through the stench of war. Hesitation froze them on the threshold. Was this a trick or mercy? That moment, the first step toward the showers, became something larger than the sum of its parts. It marked the collapse of a certainty that the enemy must be cruel. For women raised under years of propaganda about Allied barbarity, the offering of soap and warmth was almost incomprehensible. Across Western Europe, similar scenes unfolded as the Allies turned policy into practice. Modular shower units, steam delousing tunnels, laundry drums, and medical protocols designed not merely to clean, but to civilize. Behind those systems stood an unexpected philosophy that hygiene could be both an instrument of health and a statement of values. The consequences rippled far beyond the camps. German intelligence officers, from Wehrmacht field units to SD branches, collected testimonies from repatriated prisoners who spoke of American guards offering towels and fresh uniforms. Their memos trembled with unease. If the enemy treated captives decently, what did that say about the moral authority of the Reich? Among soldiers still fighting, whispers of the women who were allowed to bathe eroded faith in the propaganda that had sustained them through years of hardship. The contradiction was too stark to ignore. This story contains no great clash of armor or fire. Instead, it unfolds in the quiet confrontation between ideology and decency, between the expectation of cruelty and the shock of compassion. It shows that even in war's harshest hours, power can express itself not only through dominance, but through restraint. The Allies, whether consciously or instinctively, wielded cleanliness as persuasion, creating small breaches in the mental fortresses of their enemies. In the end, they did not win by soap alone. Yet in those brief human exchanges, the warmth of water, the disbelief on faces, the stunned reports in German intelligence files, the moral architecture of the conflict revealed itself. To allow the defeated to bathe was to assert that civilization still stood amid the wreckage. From the muddy barbed wire of early 1945 to the ideological tremors that followed, this episode reminds us that sometimes the smallest gestures carry the deepest power. A bar of soap, passed from captor to captive, became more than hygiene. It became symbolic victory, a proof that humanity, even when weaponized, can still cleanse more than it wounds.